How close did we really come to disappearing without even knowing it? People imagine the Cold War as a long stare down, a chess match of giants, a careful balance of fear and strategy, but the truth is far stranger, far more fragile, because the world didn't almost end in a battlefield, or a secret lab, or a missile silo. It almost ended in a place no one expected, in a room where the silence was louder than the alarms. And before we go there, you have to understand one thing: in the Cold War, danger didn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looked like routine, sometimes it looked like nothing at all. But let's start with a moment you've probably heard of, but never truly understood. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff so tense that people still imagine it as the closest we ever came to nuclear war. But what if I told you that the crisis you know was only the surface, that beneath it was another story, hidden, buried, almost forgotten, and that story was the one that nearly decided everything? Think about this: if the world was seconds away from destruction, would you know it? Would anyone? On the night of October 27, 1962, the sky didn't look different. No red glow, no distant rumble, no sign that history was standing on the edge of a cliff. Even the people alive at that very moment felt nothing unusual. They were eating dinner, arguing with their children, listening to the radio, completely unaware that a single misunderstanding could have turned the entire planet into ash. That's the part nobody mentions. You imagine apocalypse with bright lights and sirens, but the truth is that the closest we ever came happened in darkness, in suffocating heat, under the ocean. But hold that thought. Before we descend into the water, you need to understand how the world reached that point, not from the perspective of politicians or generals, but from something much more human: fear. In the Cold War, fear didn't just sit in meeting rooms, it crawled into people's homes, their thoughts, their sleep. Children practiced hiding under desks, adults built shelters they knew wouldn't save them, radio hosts spoke in calm voices while the world quietly panicked. If you walked down a street in 1962, you would have seen it in people's eyes, a mixture of denial and dread, like everyone was pretending a storm wasn't forming right above them. But fear alone doesn't start wars, misunderstanding does, and the Cold War was built on misunderstandings, messages delivered too late, threats exaggerated, signals misread, intentions twisted by distance and paranoia. The United States believed the Soviet Union was preparing to strike. The Soviet Union believed the United States was on the brink of an invasion. Both sides thought they were seconds away from being attacked, so both sides prepared to defend themselves. And in that constant, echoing fear, the world became a maze of shadows, everyone reacting to ghosts that felt real. Now imagine being one of the men responsible for interpreting those shadows. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit control room, fluorescent lights buzzing, the smell of metal and cold coffee in the air, knowing that one wrong interpretation could kill millions. Imagine staring at a radar screen and wondering, is that a real threat? Or just a glitch? Imagine holding a phone connected to the most powerful weapons on Earth, and thinking, if I make the wrong call, there won't be a second chance. That's the atmosphere the world lived in. That's what made the Cold War so terrifying, not the weapons themselves, but the uncertainty surrounding them. But we still haven't reached the secret. We're close, very close. The real danger didn't happen in Washington or Moscow. It didn't happen in the Oval Office or the Kremlin. It didn't happen in a meeting of world leaders trying to reason through the crisis. It happened because of a split-second interpretation, from people who couldn't afford to make mistakes, and yet were forced to make decisions with almost no information. This is where the story becomes almost unbearable, because what kept the world alive wasn't power, or strategy, or brilliant diplomacy. It was doubt, pure, instinctive, human doubt, doubt that something wasn't as it seemed. Doubt that the silence between nations meant war, doubt that the world was already burning. But doubt isn't something you can measure, predict, or record in a historical timeline. It's something that happened inside a few individuals, in moments so small they almost disappear. That's why history barely mentions them. That's why most people never hear their names, and that's where the secret hides. But before revealing it, let's pause on one crucial detail, a detail people often skip. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US didn't know the Soviets had already deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the Soviets didn't know how close the US was to launching an invasion. Think about the weight of that misunderstanding. An entire war could have started simply because neither side knew what the other had already done, and in that confusion, the world didn't just come close to destruction, it hovered above it, suspended, waiting for the smallest nudge. But here's the part that should unsettle you the most. That nudge almost came from a mistake so mundane, you might not believe it: a misinterpreted signal, a depth charge dropped as a warning, a submarine too deep to receive updated information, a crew convinced that the surface was already on fire, all of it converging in a metal tube hidden beneath the Caribbean Sea. Yet even now, you're only sensing the shape of the truth, the outline of the secret, not the secret itself. Because the real question isn't just what happened, it's why didn't it happen? What stopped it? Who stopped it? How could a world armed to its teeth collapse down to one moment, one decision, one breath? And how is it possible that most people alive today have no idea they owe their existence to a choice made in a place they will never see? Feel the weight of that question, hold it for a moment, because it leads us directly to the center of the mystery, not the missiles, not the presidents, not the public speeches or threats broadcast over television. No, the truth lies deeper, literally, the truth sits in the dark, humid bowels of a submarine that had no way of knowing the world above hadn't ended, a submarine surrounded by explosions. Cut off from communication, carrying weapons powerful enough to trigger a global nuclear war. Inside that submarine, the air tasted like metal, sweat clung to every surface, men breathed in shallow gasps, not knowing how much oxygen was left. Every sound, every groan of the hull, every distant thud, felt like a countdown, and in that suffocating darkness, 3 men had to make a decision: launch or hold. 2 chose launch, only one hesitated, only one sensed something was wrong, only one refused to believe the illusion of certainty. And if you're wondering whether that hesitation mattered, here's the truth: it saved the world. But the deeper question, the one that ties this entire story into a loop you can't escape, is this: if humanity survived because one man dared to question what everyone else accepted, how many times have we been saved by doubts we never knew existed? This is the beginning of the secret, the first layer. And if you think this was the whole story, it wasn't even close, because what happened next is far more unsettling. If part 1 left you with the uneasy realization that humanity's survival depended on a single hesitation, part 2 will show you just how thin that hesitation truly was. Now we descend into the heart of the secret. Into the steel coffin drifting beneath the Caribbean Sea. The submarine was called B-59, though the name hardly matters. What matters is what it carried, and what the men inside believed was happening above them. But before plunging deeper, consider this question: if you were trapped in the dark, cut off from the world, hearing explosions above you, would you trust silence or fear? Because that was the decision the men of B-59 faced, not between war and peace, but between what they thought they knew, and what they feared was already true. Inside that submarine, the air was thick enough to chew, the temperature climbed past unbearable, men wiped sweat from their faces only for more to drip into their eyes. The smell of oil, metal, and human panic wrapped around everything. The crew had been submerged for days, their batteries were almost dead, their CO2 filters were failing, men were fainting, hallucinating, losing their grip on what was real. And the explosions above them, American depth charges, echoed through the hull like the heartbeat of a dying beast. But here's the part the world rarely mentions: those depth charges were not intended to destroy the submarine, they were a signal, a demand to surface. But the submarine crew didn't know that. To them, every blast sounded like the opening notes of a war they assumed had already begun. Imagine hearing those explosions and believing the world outside was already burning. Imagine believing that everything you knew, your home, your family, your country, was gone, and that you were the last weapon left. Now hold that image tightly, because inside B-59, 3 men were about to decide the fate of the Earth. The decision required unanimous consent. All 3 officers had to agree to launch the nuclear torpedo. 2 said yes almost immediately. The first officer believed the war had already started. The second believed they had no choice. Both felt the crushing weight of duty. A duty to respond, to retaliate, to strike back. But the third man, he hesitated. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. Barely anyone outside the military knew his name, even fewer understood his role. History nearly erased him, and yet he carried the entire planet in his refusal to agree. But why did he refuse? Why, in a moment when panic, heat, fear, and exhaustion pushed everyone toward destruction? Did he hold on to doubt? That is the question historians still can't fully answer. And maybe it's the question we're afraid to answer, because Arkhipov didn't have better information. He didn't have a secret message. He wasn't told that the explosions were warnings and not attacks. All he had was a feeling that something wasn't right, a feeling that the world couldn't have ended without a sign, a feeling that silence wasn't confirmation, it was a clue. But think about the weight he was resisting. He wasn't just disagreeing with his comrades, he was resisting the psychological gravity of the Cold War itself. Fear tells you to act, silence tells you to assume the worst, heat and pressure strip away logic. Exhaustion crushes reason, and in that dark steel chamber, everything pushed him toward the same conclusion: strike first. Strike now. Strike before it's too late. Yet Arkhipov didn't. he stood in the steaming blackness. Sweat dripping down his spine, and said something that would echo through history, "No. We wait." Just 2 words against the momentum of a planet spiraling toward annihilation, and here's where the curiosity loop tightens. Why did he trust his doubt more than the evidence around him? Was it instinct? Was it fear of making the wrong decision? Was it faith that there was still something left to save? Or was it something deeper, the faint, haunting sense that silence is not an answer, but a warning to listen closer? The submarine officers argued, voices rose, men were on the brink of heatstroke. Some thought Arkhipov was being cowardly, others thought he was being irrational, but somehow, his refusal held. Minutes passed, the submarine shook again with another blast, the lights flickered, systems strained, and still. Arkhipov didn't change his mind, but here's the detail that bends the entire story into something almost unbelievable. His hesitation wasn't calm, it wasn't heroic in the cinematic sense, it wasn't even confident, it was full of fear, and maybe that's what saved the world, the fear of making the wrong decision stalling the fear that pushed the others to strike. Fear versus fear, instinct versus instinct, silence versus noise, and somehow, doubt won. Eventually, slowly, painfully, the officers agreed to surface instead of launching, and what they saw when they rose from the ocean was not a world consumed in nuclear fire, but American ships waiting in tense formation, prepared, anxious, alert, but still at peace. Imagine the shock. Imagine the wave of realization crashing over the crew. They had been seconds from launching a nuclear torpedo, based entirely on assumptions created by heat, fear, isolation, and human error. Now think of this, if Arkhipov hadn't been there, the world would not be here. Not in this form, perhaps not at all, but the story doesn't end with the submarine surfacing. If anything, this is where the real mystery begins, because the world often attributes its survival to strategy, negotiation, or military discipline. But this moment exposes a truth far more unsettling. Humanity survived not because of strength, but because of uncertainty. Because one man listened to the quiet voice inside that said, "What if we're wrong?" And that question, that single, fragile question, became the invisible thread that kept the planet from unraveling. But let's widen the lens again, because while the submarine episode is one of the most dramatic examples, the Cold War was filled with moments just like it, moments when misunderstandings piled up like explosives, ready to ignite with the smallest spark. There were false alarms in missile silos, computer errors that showed incoming attacks that didn't exist, radar systems glitching at the worst possible moments. Commanders who hesitated, not because they were certain, but because something felt off. In each of those moments, the world was balanced on a knife edge so thin it was almost invisible. And here's the deeper question, the question that brings the loop full circle. If the world has survived this long because of hesitation and doubt, what happens the day someone chooses certainty instead? Because certainty is dangerous, certainty closes the door to questions, certainty convinces leaders, and ordinary people, that they know the truth, even when they don't. Certainty is what almost killed us, and uncertainty, the quiet, shaky, humankind, is what saved us. But the Cold War didn't end with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it didn't resolve with the submarine surfacing, it didn't disappear when leaders shook hands, or when treaties were signed, or when walls came down, because the secret that almost destroyed the world was never about politics, or ideology, or weapons, it was about human perception. And if you think that perception changed after 1962, consider this. There were at least 8 other moments after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world almost misinterpreted itself into oblivion, 8 invisible cliffs, 8 times we stepped close enough to feel the wind of the abyss. 8 moments where the wrong assumption would have rewritten history, and if those moments could happen once, they can happen again. But before we go deeper into those other incidents, before we explore how close the world came in 1979, in 1983, in 1995, before we confront the question of whether the danger has truly ended, or simply changed form, you have to understand the most disturbing truth of all. The Cold War wasn't just a war of weapons, it was a war of imaginations, of what each side believed the other capable of interpretations, illusions, shadows, of fear dressed as certainty, and doubt disguised as weakness. And the real danger, the secret beneath the secret, is that every generation believes it wouldn't make the same mistakes, but history whispers something different. It whispers that fear is timeless, misunderstanding is timeless, and the human tendency to assume the worst is timeless. So ask yourself again, the same question that haunted the officers inside the submarine: what if what we think we know is the very thing that blinds us? This story isn't over, not in part 1, not in part 2, not even now, because the Cold War didn't end, it just changed shape. and the world still carries the same fragile threads that once nearly snapped beneath the ocean. But the real twist, the truth that binds this entire narrative together, is waiting in the next chapter.